Hey, how's it going? My name's Will. I don't work at a used record store. I don't own an iguana, although I'm sure they make great pets. I don't have dreadlocks or play the acoustic guitar. I can remember quite well, thank you, and no, I don't constantly have the munchies. When 420 comes around, I've still got 40 minutes of work left. I've never hit a girl on a bike with my car or shot my friend with a shotgun. I've never had to apologize for letting a girl I was watching drown in a pool while I was getting high because, duh, I wouldn't be getting high if I was around children. I'm a regular guy who works regular jobs, just like the majority of all Americans who use marijuana occasionally and responsibly. My name is Will, and I'm normal.
Produced and distributed by the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws in Washington, D.C. This is your daily audio stash, the growing truth about cannabis. Welcome to the most popular audio podcast regarding marijuana in all of America and all the world, featuring interviews with scientists, politicians, doctors, prohibition policy activists, regular cannabis consumers, musicians, and NORML staff and NORML's board of directors, along with music and comedy no other podcast can offer. You can always find out more about the show at our website, NORMLAudiostash.com. We're ending marijuana prohibition with education, one listener at a time. Welcome back to the Audio Stash. Today, I'm your host, Chris Goldstein. Take a moment to join us at NORML to end marijuana prohibition in America. Just visit NORML.org. We have a wonderful show for you here today. Some great pod-safe music later in the program. We'll also speak with NORML's Executive Director, Alan St. Pierre, about the new NORML Zogby poll. First up today, we have an important action alert from Ohio and news from NORML. First up today, an action alert from NORML. 1 year ago this week, on March 29th, 2006, the Cincinnati City Council passed a quote-unquote emergency city ordinance, recriminalizing minor marijuana possession, despite an outpouring of opposition to the measure from NORML activists and concerned citizens. Under the ordinance, marijuana offenders in Cincinnati now face a $250 fine, up to 30 days in jail, and a criminal record for possessing small quantities of cannabis. By contrast, under Ohio state law, possession of up to 100 grams of marijuana is punishable by just a $100 citation and no jail time. In a last-minute compromise, council members decided to add a, quote, sunset provision, close quote, to the ordinance, meaning the law would expire after a year unless renewed by the council. This provision expires on Thursday, and we're asking you for your support to see that it isn't renewed. When arguing for this measure, proponents on the city council claimed that recriminalizing cannabis would dramatically reduce overall crime and discourage citizens from neighboring states from entering Cincinnati to purchase marijuana. This has not been the case. According to statistics published by the Cincinnati Police Department, the number of murders, rapes, burglaries, and robberies in the city have all increased since the passage of the recriminalization ordinance. In addition, crime statistics indicate that only 3% of those cited under the ordinance were from states other than Ohio. We have links to all those statistics at NORMLAudiostash.com. According to Acting Police Chief Vincent L. DeMasi, enactment of the ordinance increased city police costs by more than 150% in just the first 6 months. From April 2006 through September 2006, the law department spent $45,600 defending city ordinance cases, versus having only spent $17,800 during this same period in 2005. During the first 6 months, over 2,300 Cincinnati citizens were cited on minor marijuana charges and prosecuted through the city courts. Over 1,000 citizens were convicted of misdemeanor marijuana possession and given a criminal record. Tomorrow on Tuesday, March 27th, the Cincinnati City Council Law and Public Safety Committee will hear a presentation from police officials regarding the one-year impact of recriminalization. Despite the ordinance's failure to reduce crime, it is anticipated that law enforcement will push to extend the law. In fact, Councilmember Cecil Thomas, the ordinance's original sponsor, has already filed a motion to extend the measure, quote, indefinitely, close quote. We have links to that notice at NORMLAudiostash.com. Please take a moment today to contact the members of the Cincinnati City Council and tell them to oppose this motion. A vote on this measure is expected later this week, so it's pertinent that you write and call the council today. If you reside in the Cincinnati area, please consider attending and or speaking at Tuesday's Law and Public Safety Committee meeting, which begins at 2 p.m. For more than 3 decades, Ohio's state decriminalization law has served as an example for the rest of the nation. Please do not let the actions of a handful of members of the Cincinnati City Council overturn this long-standing protection for its citizens. More information on how you can get involved today can be found with links at NORMLAudiostash.com. Next up today, it's our news from NORML. British report recommends fresh look at UK drug classification and legal penalties. A comprehensive overview of different substances and how they are classified, and in some cases criminalized, showed the current system used in the UK was not offering an evidence-based drug policy. The UK uses an ABC drug classification system, similar to the Controlled Substances Act of the United States. In both systems, tobacco and alcohol are scheduled in a manner to allow retail production and regulated consumption. In the United States, marijuana is classified as Schedule 1 to allow the strictest controls, resulting in prohibition and criminalization of use or possession. The new British report calls for an evidence and science-based review of the British ABC system and called into question the reasoning for certain classifications. Colin Blakemore is chief executive of the Medical Research Council and authored the report published in the Lancet Medical Journal. The team comprised law enforcement, medical professionals, and legal experts in the review. It began with a group of 29 consultant psychiatrists who specialize in addiction who were asked to rate the evidence of harm caused by 20 drugs, including heroin, cocaine, cannabis, ecstasy, LSD, and tobacco. They were asked to rate the drugs in 9 categories. 3 of these related to physical harm, 3 to the likelihood of addiction, and 3 to the social harms, such as healthcare costs, and then asked for additional analysis from 16 professionals in a variety of fields. The final rankings placed heroin and cocaine as the most dangerous of the 20 drugs. Alcohol was 5th, the Class C drug ketamine 6th, and tobacco 9th place, just behind amphetamines or speed. Cannabis was 11th, while LSD and ecstasy were 14th and 18th respectively. The team's report mentions that if the current ABC system is retained, alcohol would be rated a Class A drug, and tobacco Class B, from a dispassionate, evidence-based perspective. Cannabis was downgraded from Class B to Class C, amid much public furor, but police and government officials largely acknowledge the new approach to cannabis has proved a success. Even with the reclassification, those found in possession of certain larger amounts of cannabis, those cultivating it or even seen smoking it, can still be subject to prosecution and a variety of penalties, including jail time. The full text of the study can be read online at www.thelancet.com. We have links to it today on our website at normalaudiostash.com. Next up on the Audio Stash today, we got some great pod-safe music found up at the Independent Online Distribution Alliance. Here's some Barrington Levy with Ragamuffin.
Strings. No matter where you go, that you're always there with you. Anything you say, that you're always hearing you. Anything you do, that is watching you. See, ragamuffin, 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 ragamuffin. Ragamuffin, ragamuffin, stop your loafing. Ragamuffin, 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 stop your shooting. The fool had said in his heart that there is no God. Oh, they are corrupt, they have done abominable works. They are none that do it good. Oh no, not one. Ragamuffin, 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 ragamuffin. Whoa, toodle-whoa, toodle-waps, toodle-whoa. All the workers of iniquity, no knowledge, who eat up my people's flesh as they eat bread. Ragamuffin, stop your huffing. Ragamuffin, stop your loafing. Give thanks and praise every day, my brethren. Give thanks and praise every day, my sisters. Anywhere you go, God is there with you. Ragamuffin, 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 stop your loafing. Ragamuffin, 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 stop your loafing. Whoa, whoa, see, whoa. Anything you do, don't you know that is watching you? Anything you say, that is hearing you. Oh, my brethren, of all the workers of iniquity, no knowledge. Who eat up all my people's flesh as they eat bread? Them a ragamuffin, stop your huffing. Ragamuffin, stop your looting. Ragamuffin, stop your huffing. Ragamuffin, stop your shooting. Ragamuffin, 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 stop your loafing.
Reggae all-star Barrington Levy here on Normal's Daily Audio Stash today with that track Ragamuffin, found up at the Independent Online Distribution Alliance. Next up today, Alan St. Pierre, the Executive Director of NORML in Washington, D.C., joins us today to talk about a brand new Zogby poll that shows a very slight but a majority of Americans believe that decriminalizing marijuana is the right thing to do. Alan, welcome back to the program here today.
Hey, Chris.
So first, Alan, tell us about the poll.
Well, back in February, we commissioned Zogby to do a poll for us, a group we've used many times in the past, and we asked this very question. 35 years ago, the National Commission on Marijuana and Drug Abuse recommended removing criminal penalties for the personal use of marijuana by adults. Do you support or oppose a law in Congress that would eliminate federal penalties for the personal use of marijuana by adults and allow states to adopt their own marijuana policies? And so the results of that question to over 1,000 American voters was an amazing split right down the middle in this country, which in some ways was not too surprising. 49% of Americans support decriminalizing marijuana at the federal level and allowing states to set their own policies, and 48% oppose. So for the first time in our 36 years of polling, this is the first time that a majority of Americans would like to see something one could describe as progressive on the topic of marijuana that is not related to the medicinal use of marijuana.
And what was the political split here?
Well, it does break down kind of interestingly along some party lines. In the end, Democrats, 51% of them supported the proposal. Independents, 62%. But kind of ironic in my mind is that when it comes to Republicans, only 37% support the notion, if you will, of states' rights for marijuana, for decriminalizing it. So a party that has very much wrapped itself up in the notion of states' rights and allowing states to be the laboratories of democracy and that the states know more than the dumb old beltway federal government, I think it's kind of ironic that by almost 15 to 20 percentage points, Democrats and independents support this notion of states' rights more than Republicans. Apparently, there's always the great marijuana exception to the logic of conservatives.
And how about the split between men and women?
Well, this is a definite and important split. In fact, in my observations from this particular poll, one of the more salient topics would be the split between men and women. 57% of men supported the notion and only 41% of women. And that is a huge split between the two. And by the way, we have always seen a disparity both in the use of marijuana and those who support changing the laws between men and women. There always has been a slight, maybe 5-8% difference, but we rarely see it get into double digits as high as this.
Now, this poll shows a majority of support. Is that something that's gone up over the years?
Yes, good question. In fact, there is a terrific rising tide of support for marijuana. In fact, it's an 80% increase since 1992. The traditional support level since 1967 in Gallup polls, later NORML polls, Zogby polls, it is indicated up until about the early 90s that about 1 in 5, 20% of Americans support the notion straight up of legalizing marijuana. Those numbers have risen precipitously in just 14 years to now a national average of 36% of Americans believe that marijuana should just be straight up legalized and put on the shelf with alcohol and tobacco products. And if one remembers the vote totals in Nevada, it has crept up from 39% to nearly 44% in one particular state. So it's the graying of the baby boom generation. I think certainly the blowback from 70 years of prohibition, and as biased as I may be on this subject matter, the self-evident failure, the abject failure of cannabis prohibition after 70 years is pretty self-evident to many Americans. The moral and social dissonance around marijuana is so high in this country that government is not at all achieving its goals in trying to stop people from using it, from the country growing it, from it being imported into the country. And for one of the most important reasons we're told from the federal government why we keep marijuana illegal is so that children fear it and that children don't have access to it and that children wouldn't use it. Unfortunately, the data is pretty clear. Children do have access to it, and in many data sets, it's clear that the children admit to having more access to untaxed, unregulated marijuana than they do taxed and regulated substances like alcohol, tobacco, and pharmaceutical products.
Now, Alan, away from the 1970s and the Schaefer Commission here in modern times, how do other political factors come into play here, like, say, the war in Iraq and the like? those things that might change the public's view of the overall ability of government to make good decisions about national issues. How much does that come into play when we talk about a change in prohibition?
Well, we actually asked this question a couple of years ago. As a matter of fact, we asked the question just 2 months after 9/11. We asked Americans, what are your priorities? Is your priority protecting American borders and trying to thwart terrorism at the domestic level, or is it to continue the status quo regarding arresting hundreds of thousands of Americans? And by a very large majority, I think it was something like 68% of Americans said that clearly it was a greater priority to go after terrorists and whatnot than it was to get involved with domestic law enforcement for marijuana. Not surprisingly, tin-eared as they are to the public, because one presumes the Drug Czar's office does the same type of polling that we do. In fact, I know they do. I actually have access to some of their polling numbers through Freedom of Information Act requests. That at that same period of time, they put out ads that I think most everybody listening will remember, claiming that those who smoked marijuana actually supported terrorism. The actual opposite effect of what most people's perception was about where they wanted their tax money spent in keeping the country and their children safe. So yes, to a degree, since 9/11, there has been a reprioritization in the minds of many Americans about how law enforcement should best be used. And chasing down an adult marijuana smoker in their home has got to be at the lowest end of the scale. And by the way, in the 1980s and throughout most of the 1990s, almost always in the top 10 concerns of Americans about the quality of their lives or issues they would be voting on in the next election, always crime and the fear of drugs was always in the top tier. It has fallen off since 1999. It isn't even in the top 20 anymore. It's essentially not a concern of most Americans when generally asked what are their concerns about this country and the future for their children.
And is that a catch-22, though, Alan? Because it's dropped off that voter priority list, does that make it easier for politicians to maintain the status quo?
In many respects it does, because people's attention rightly is directed towards something like terrorism or bioterrorism and the environment as a whole, one could argue. But at the same time, it's because of the Internet, the blogosphere as it's known, proliferation of media like YouTube and, of course, podcasts, that Americans now have the ability to disseminate so much more information regarding what the government is doing and to talk about it in almost real time that the watchdogs are really watching those who are in government right now and how they act and comport themselves. So, I don't suspect we're going to see in time the same sort of mindless campaigns we've seen from the ONDCP. We're not going to see ads that claim that marijuana smoking is going to lead to terrorism, or that we're not likely going to see what was a terrible thing in the 1990s, which was the federal government secretly embedding anti-marijuana, anti-drug content into popular television shows, for which later NORML sued the federal government successfully to stop that. I don't think they'll ever try those practices again, because now we can disseminate that information to hundreds of thousands of people in 5 minutes at almost no cost.
And further, with all this polling data, all the local initiatives conduct polls as well. And every poll we've seen the last couple of years shows support for marijuana being decriminalized or made available as a medicine. Is there a sense here that Congress and the President need to have some sort of new national commission like what we saw in 1972 on marijuana, and at least look at this issue again in modern terms the way they did with the Schaefer Commission in 1972?
Yes, absolutely. As much as, a lot of folks could be frustrated and think of this as just bizarre incrementalism to have yet another commission that, I'm not a betting person, I try not to play soothsayer here in Washington, but very likely the commission would opine the same that it did 35 years ago and recognize that marijuana certainly should be decriminalized for adult responsible use. There's seemingly no question there in the American mind, and the data 35 years after the Schaefer Commission's recommendations would strongly support such. So it would appear that they would probably opine the same way. The question is, would we then have the political leadership that would take it, as often is the case, by the way, when commissions are created, when the adversarial process of the legislative process in our country falls apart. It's acknowledged that it's just too complicated, it's too partisan a topic, and so what do? The executive branch or legislative branch often puts together a blue ribbon commission of all kinds of stakeholders and all kinds of recognized experts that everybody accepts as being legitimate. They then meet for a few months, a year. They then put together a large report, and thankfully, under most circumstances, the body that asked for the report follows the recommendations of the blue ribbon panel. This, of course, is one of the great aberrations in this, as often is the case with anything having to do with marijuana and the federal government. We have, as you well know, you can listen to Richard Nixon's reaction on the tapes when told that the Schaefer Commission is going to recommend decriminalizing it. He's essentially saying it is DOA, dead on arrival. I'm not going to do anything with that. Now, thankfully, Keith Stropp and others who were running NORML in the 1970s took this 5,500-page report and took it like a writ and went to 50 different states, because we live in the United States of America, and the states do have great autonomy and great latitude to amend their drug laws. And so thankfully today, 1/3 of the U.S. population, 100 million people, live in a state or municipality where marijuana is decriminalized, and about 1/5 of the nation lives in a state where marijuana has been, if you will, medicalized. So the importance of the Schaefer Commission can hardly be understated today, how important it was that it changed the law at the state level. Yes, the federal government failed to implement it. Now, 5 years after the fact, President Carter took the Schaefer Commission, and he ran his presidency campaign as one of the platforms to decriminalize marijuana, and simply just read rhyme and verse right out of the Schaefer Commission. August 3rd, 1977, he says marijuana should be decriminalized based on the recommendations from the Schaefer Commission. And unfortunately, it's the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980 that stops entirely that effort to decriminalize marijuana. And since 1980, there has been no viable marijuana decriminalization effort in Congress until, I hope, this year, 2007.
And Alan, why is this polling data and this type of polling so important?
Okay, well, it's really important to look at our data set here from the Zogby polling, because it is a roadmap to putting together the majority needed in this country to legalize marijuana. And what I mean by that is that we are failing terribly in a couple different communities in educating to them the need to reform marijuana laws. Most importantly, the largest growing minority in this country, Hispanics, they support marijuana law reform at the lowest possible numbers in our survey. 26% of Hispanics support legalizing marijuana. That is almost half of African Americans, which is 50%, and again, half of whites. So of that one subgroup in America, if we don't outreach to them properly and effectively, then it's going to be really hard to push our numbers into a majority. The other are women, as we mentioned earlier. 3 are Republicans, and 4 are parents between the ages of 25 and 50. Something magical happens between those years where individuals who support marijuana law reform, after having children and during the time of raising the children, they, by a much larger degree, do not support reforming the laws, but after they turn 50, the traditional age of when most of the children have left the nest, if you will, then the numbers go right back up again. So those are the 4 subgroups that we've got to better educate, or we're not going to reach a majority number.
And Alan, one of the biggest shifts we've seen in American politics, that I've seen at least in the last few years, is this increased politicking around medicine. You know, just last week we had the National Institutes of Health director testifying before a congressional committee that the federal ban on new stem cell lines is holding back science. is there a sense that Americans are more aware and savvy of the relationship between regulators, the government, and the medical and science community out there?
Well, I think people are mindful, including the situation with the woman who wanted to, her family wanted her to end her life, Terry Schiavo, that, it is a good example of where a lot of Americans can stand back and say, wait a minute, doesn't look like I have a lot of autonomy over my life, that some unelected or in some cases elected bureaucrats and technocrats are making decisions about individual self-preservation. And this past week with Angel Rach losing her case in the Ninth Circuit, it's put the focus once again on where do individual rights begin and where do the federal government's powers end. And so, whether it's in the abstract, such as we're talking about here regarding medical marijuana, or when you combine it with these other issues, including the traditional argument in the West, in Oregon, about the right to die and their success against the federal government as being the only state that allows their citizens autonomy that the citizens, myself included here in the District of Columbia, don't enjoy. And so, yes, I think there's a much larger discussion and mindfulness about the autonomy of the individual versus the power of, at times, what feels like an all-too-powerful centralized federal government.
Alan, I want to thank you for coming on the program today to explore this Zogby poll a bit further. Thanks for joining us here again today.
Well, my pleasure. Thank you, Chris.
Alan St. Pierre is the Executive Director of NORML in Washington, D.C. He welcomes your questions and comments. Send him an email to foundation@norml.org. You've been listening to NORML's Daily Audio Stash, the growing truth about cannabis. Make sure you visit our website at normalaudiostash.com. That's NORMLAUDIOSTASH.com for more information about every day's show. I'm your host, Chris Goldstein. Thanks for listening today. See you at 4:20 tomorrow. Podcasting technology of NORML is made possible by Red Aphid Interactive Media. More information at redapphid.com.